try to do two things in this workshop. One is to just sort of give you, well, let's start with a question. So how many of you consider yourself at least somewhat familiar with what the MBTA has proposed to do to fares and bus? Okay, good. So then I'll go quickly over that and talk much more about where can you find data and how can you marshal data. And to do that, I'm both going to point you at different sources, and I'm going to give a couple examples of ways in which the Dukakis Center has started to assemble data, not our data, but other people's data, to start to tell stories. So it's a good follow-up to the panel you just heard, right? Because all the data in the world doesn't change anybody's mind unless you marshal that data in a way that tells a story. So I'm gonna talk about data and where there's data and what we do and don't know. I'm gonna talk a little bit about where there might be an opportunity to poke some holes in the MBTA's data that they used to set the fare increases, but in particular the service cuts, the proposed service cuts, which have been very controversial. And then I'm going to sort of show you how the Dukakis Center is using a couple different data sets to try to tell a story that we hope will influence the broader debate, which is really about are other resources going to be made available to the MBTA so that they don't have to, so that the ultimate outcome isn't as bad as it could be given the proposals that are on the table. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Stephanie Pollack, the Associate Director of the Dukakis Center here at Northeastern University. The first time I worked on a proposed MBTA fare increase was when the fares went from 50 cents to 75 cents. So that will just give you an idea of how long I have been plugging away at this set of issues. So what I want to talk about is a little bit of background on the MBTA's overall financial condition, because that's the context for these, and they talk about it a little bit, but I talk about it a little differently than they do. What the actual proposal is, and then most importantly, where can you find data actually on the MBTA website, because there's a lot of it that's not in the part of the website about the fare proposal, and then where outside the MBTA can you find data that's useful, and then again how you can put that together. So some quick background. You know, the T's been around for a long time. We're currently on the third iteration of how the MBTA's finances work. It's been in effect since 2000. The good news was at that point, until 2000, every year, those of us who worked on transit had to go to the legislature and beg for money for the T. As of then, the T gets a penny of what was then the 5-cent sales tax, what's now the 6.25% sales tax. So they get that money, and they get it before it goes anywhere else. It's truly theirs, even when it's a bad budget year like it's been, it can't be taken away from them. And they're allowed to issue their own bonds, and because they have two revenue sources actually that are theirs. One is assessments from the cities and towns they serve. They come off their cherry sheet aid, and one is the sales tax. The MBTA issues bonds that are called revenue bonds because they're backed by a specific stream of revenue instead of general obligation bonds, which are just bonds that the state says are a general obligation. So the good news is the T has a great bonds. They pay really low interest. They have a better rating than the state, and the state has a really good rating actually. And the bad news is we'll see as they use it. The other thing you need to know as background is the T actually runs two budgets. Like most transportation agencies, they have an operating budget. That's every year, just what does it cost to run the system, and then they have a capital budget. That's how do you pay for the bigger things. So fixing the system, buying new trains, fixing the tracks, fixing the signals, fixing the stations. So I'm going to talk a little bit. So the proposal to increase fares and eliminate buses came out of a deficit in the operating budget, but in fact they have an even bigger problem on the capital side that we need to talk about, because one of the two proposals seems to be pointed more in the direction of downsizing the system to avoid future capital costs. So that's why I get to talk about both. So the team really has to do four things, right, with a very limited amount of money. They have to run the system. Trains got to run, the buses got to run. They gotta shovel snow at the stations, pay for gas for the buses, pay for labor. They have to pay debt service. We're going to talk about that on all those bonds. They should be maintaining the system in what's usually referred to as a state of good repair. But you know, since you have to run the system, what tends to happen is when there's not enough money to operate the system and to fix the system, you defer the maintenance. And that's just as true with the highways and the bridges in the state as it is with the T, but today we're going to talk about the T. And then they should be, right, making investments to grow the system. because transit's a good thing. We want more transit. We want more transit riders. We want those because it supports economic development, connects workers to jobs, connects students, reduces the environmental footprint of the transport sector. So we should be growing the system, but if you think that we shortchange, investing in maintenance, you'll see. There's no money left at the end of the day for expansion. So really the T doesn't have one financial problem, it has four financial problems. It can't pay its operating budget, can't pay its debt, doesn't have enough money to fix the system, and has basically nothing at this point to expand the system. So one of the, I think, most wonderful examples of really trying to use data in a way that is accessible to the public on an issue that has been somewhat opaque is an effort by a coalition that the Dukakis Center is part of called Transportation for Massachusetts. And in this past fall, we put out this report called Maxed Out, which is a primer. It's designed as a primer on transportation finance in Massachusetts because we concluded that the system was literally so complicated that even some of us weren't sure we understood it, and we were positive the general public and legislatures and other policymakers didn't. So that's a resource that's now out there that wasn't before, and just to give you an example, this is one graphic from that primer which just explains where money goes, right? So most people think that when you pay the gas tax or when you pay those fees at the registry, that the transportation department of the T takes your money and it actually fixes the roads. But it doesn't. It takes that money and it puts it into a pot called the Commonwealth Transportation Fund, and that Commonwealth Transportation Fund has $1.5 in round numbers billion every year from gas taxes and registry fees. But before and that seems like a lot of money, and actually if we had $1.5 billion to spend, we would be in great shape. But the first thing that happens with that money is the Secretary of Administration and Finance says, wait a minute, in addition to those bonds I told you that the MBTA issues every year, Massachusetts issues bonds every year. The state has its own capital plan. This particular administration has actually done a great job. All the capital plans are online. You can find them. Every year they put out a new 5-year going forward plan. What should we be spending on highways and bridges and roads, but also public universities and colleges, courthouses, all the assets the state owns. And so what the Secretary of Administration and Finance says is, well, but we can only do so much because we have what's called a bond cap in this state, which means that we can only issue $1.5 billion a year in new bonds. If we issue too much, we can't pay the old ones. If we do that, then the agencies that rate bonds will say Massachusetts is not a good risk, and they'll make us pay more interest. So that's how capital spending in the state works. The bonds are issued by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. They're referred to as GO bonds because it stands for General Obligation of the Commonwealth, right? So before the transportation agencies can touch any of these registry fees and gas taxes and other part of the sales tax that they have access to, the Secretary of Administration and Finance is supposed to sort of look backwards at all the general obligation bonds that have been issued under the bond cap for the last 20 years and say, gee, I wonder how much of that we spent on transportation. However much of that we spent on transportation, we should pay for with these transportation revenues. Now, that's policy. That's not necessity. That's just how it works in Massachusetts. In other places, they pay those bonds off with general tax revenues. And in fact, when you build a courthouse or a new building at UMass, that gets paid for out of general tax revenues too. But because there is transportation money, there's this separate pot in the budget. And so the first thing that the secretary does is he says, I'm gonna take all the payments we owe this year on the state's bonds, not the T's bonds, not the MassPike's bonds, the state's bonds. I'm going to take that money out, and I'm going to pay those bondholders. So that money last year came to nearly $1 billion. So we started with $1.5 billion, but we took the first $1 billion of it, and we paid these general bonds that are the Commonwealth's bonds, okay? Because the Secretary of Administration and Finance calculated somehow, this is where data comes in, that we don't really understand, that 51% of all the outstanding debt of the entire Commonwealth of Massachusetts over the last however many years was spent on transportation. So therefore, 51% of the entire cost of paying off that debt comes from it. And in the budget that the governor just filed, that number goes up to 53%, which is really disturbing because the 5-year capital plan that was approved in November, if you look at that plan and you look for the next 5 years, what percentage of the bond cap are we planning to spend on transportation? 34%. So if last last year it was 51%, and for the next 5 years it's 34%. I don't understand how you average in the 34% with the 51% and it goes up to 53%, right? So, but this is, until we wrote, literally until we did the research for it and wrote maxed out, most of us didn't even understand that that was going on. And most legislatures that I talk to still don't actually understand that that's going on. So maxed out is a great example of trying to use data to have this conversation, okay? The other thing you need to know about the T is the T loses money on every rider. So the let's get more riders because that'll help close the deficit is not true, but they don't lose the same amount of money on every rider, right? So this is some data that, that advocates had been asking for, well, I remember asking for it in the 80s, so for a very long time, that finally the MBTA's board asked for. But again, the data I'm about to show you exists in the minutes of one of the MBTA board meetings on their website with no title to it, okay? So we're going to pull that and actually put it on our website, where they finally answered the question, by mode, how much is the subsidy, okay? So how much is the difference between what does it cost to run the whole bus system, how much bus revenue do we collect, how many passengers do we have, right? So that would give you subsidy per passenger. So this isn't cost per passenger, this is subsidy. So what you see is we subsidize every mode. Every bus trip is subsidized $3, but every commuter rail trip is subsidized almost $7, and every trip on the ride, that's what demand response is subsidized $33, which is why the ride has become such a big policy issue in this debate, right? So again, there's a series of charts that the MBTA has prepared that go mode by mode and lay out what's the cost, what's the ridership, and what's the subsidy. But literally the only place I was able to find this was by clicking through the entire set of board meeting minutes for 2011 until I hit the right month. So there's a lot of data out there, you just have to keep looking for it. And we have to do a better job of putting it in more accessible places. Okay, budget data is easy to find. So this is the T's budget for the current, the last year. It costs about $1.6 billion a year, except for $451 million of that goes to pay for bonds. Now, those are not the bonds that we just took $1 billion and paid for. Those are other bonds, okay? So we're not actually spending $1 billion a year on debt service. We're spending $1.5 billion a year on debt service. Every penny of which we could spend running the system, except that we have to pay the bondholders first, right? So the biggest source of money for the T is that penny on the sales tax. That is 47% of the T's budget. So again, think about data, think about policy, right? The legislature did saddle the T with debt. It's true. That's what people are saying in response to the fare increase. But it's also true that the legislature gave the T more money than it's ever had. And it's actually also true that Massachusetts is second only to New York State in the percent in the subsidy per transit rider that's provided from general state revenues. Okay? So, state legislature is our friend and isn't our friend, right? But it's not as easy as saying, well, they stuck the T with all this debt, the legislature should solve the problem, not the fare increases, because while they stuck the T with all this debt. And not only that, you see that slice called contract assistance? What that is remember that sales tax got raised from 5% to 6.25%? So when the legislature raised the sales tax from 5% to 6.25%, they took another chunk of the new sales tax and they said, we're going to give some of that to the T and we're going to actually give some of that to what used to be the turnpike so that tolls won't go up. So the T is actually getting another $160 million a year that legally they're not entitled to from general sales tax. So they're getting almost $900 million a year. Okay, and their own debt service is only we'll talk about what their debt service is. But the bottom line is, as much as the legislature saddled them with debt service, they gave them more revenue than the debt service. So you gotta, again, this is why data is important. So this is what do they spend their money on. The biggest thing they spend their money on, which is again why you've heard about it in the papers lately, is the commuter rail contract. So they pay MBCR, the people who run the trains that apparently can't run in the winter. Or the summer, actually, but the rest of the year, they give them $300 million a year. And you'll be hearing a lot more about that contract in the next couple of years because it runs out in 2013. And a lot of people kind of feel like that arrangement needs to be revisited. If you don't divide the pie this way, but you just ask 2 questions about the T's operating budget. How much do they spend running the system and how much do they spend paying on bonds? Then the pie chart looks like this. So they're spending about a quarter of their budget on paying for their own bonds, not the Commonwealth's bonds, their own bonds. Some of these bonds they inherited in 2000 when the legislature restructured them financially. Those are called legacy debt. Some of these bonds have been issued since then to pay for obligations that were required to build new transit, that was required to offset the impacts of the Big Dig. Those are usually referred to as the Big Dig transit commitments. And some of those bonds are being issued to actually just fix the system. At this point, they've refinanced all their debt so many times that it's actually fairly hard to say kind of which bonds were for which, but roughly speaking, in your head, it's like a third, right? So a couple of billion was the old debt that the legislature just said, oh good, now that they have a penny of the sales tax, they can pay this. A third of it was this Big Dig set of commitments, which were legally the states, but the T is paying for, and then a third is new stuff they've issued since then. So that's the actual pie chart with a third. Just so you understand, this is overwhelmingly the most debt of any transit system in the United States. Like there's not anything that's comparable to that. Like the MTA in New York is starting to get nervous because they've issued a lot of debt recently, but they're still not approaching the T. In most other states, honestly, the debt service is not paid out of the operating budget. There's just a different place in the budget from which it comes. So the current debt, they have about $5.6 billion. So there's 2 ways to talk about debt. $5.6 billion in principals. That meant if they could all pay it today, they could give the people who hold the bonds $5.6 billion and they'd be done, but they can't pay it all today, so they pay interest on it. So with the interest, it's not 5.6, it's 8.5. You know, round numbers, maybe it's 9 by now. And the thing that's a little scary about this is, so if any of you have also thought about the housing crisis, so you know how everybody kind of did these funny mortgages where you just pay the interest and you never actually pay the principal? So MBTA has $5.5 billion in outstanding debt. In last year's budget, they spent $400 or $500 million paying debt service. They paid $100 million down on the principal. They've actually refinanced all the bonds to be interest-only bonds. So if you pay $100 million a year in principal on $5.5 billion in debt, then in only 55 years you will have paid off all your principal if you don't issue any new bonds. But we have capital needs too. So over the next 5 years, there's actually a new 13 through 17 capital plan that's out for public comment right now, where I think the comment period just closed, but this is from the one that's been the last one that was approved. So over the next 5 years, the T says, we're going to spend $3.8 billion. Now, $3.8 billion, just to give you a sense, is A, a lot of money, and B, nowhere near enough. If the T were spending enough money to actually keep its system in a good state of good repair, they would be spending $800 million a year on the system. Just for state of good repair. So that would be 5 times $800 million, so they would actually be spending a little bit more than that, but some of this is in state of good repair, right? They're actually spending $2.3 billion on state of good repair over those 5 years, which means that they're spending under $500 million a year, not the $800 million they need. And the scary thing about that, it's actually 790, I should use numbers. It's that date. The scary thing about that $790 million number is that's $790 million a year. Every year for the next 20 years means the T's assets will be no worse 20 years from now than they are now. But there is a current backlog of $3 billion. So the $790 million a year is to keep the backlog from not being bigger than the $3 billion. It doesn't actually fix the $3 billion in deferred maintenance, okay? So, and to spend that money, lo and behold, they have to issue another $757 million in bonds, right? So I said, well, it's 55 years to pay off what they have if they don't issue anymore. But if they don't issue anymore, they can't fix the system at all, even at the rate that they would. And none of those numbers include building anything new, okay? Which there's a lot of really good, important ideas for other things that the MBTA should be doing. So this is the projection for the MBTA's debt service for the next, because bonds are issued for a long time, so for the next 30 years, if they issued no new bonds. So the problem that the fare increase is designed to fix, right, this structural deficit in the operating budget, is really the fact that they have all this debt service to pay, and the debt service, you know, when Jonathan Davis was the chief financial officer, he used to say, well, it does get better after 2020, but that's assuming they don't issue any bonds in 2012, and they're going to issue another couple $100 million. So in fact, all these declining bars on this graph means it doesn't yet incorporate the debt service on the bonds they haven't issued yet. So that chart never does this, right? Every year you issue more bonds, and those out year graphs go up. So it's not a happy situation, and I didn't mean to start by getting everyone depressed, but I've done this talk, I can't even count how many times anymore, and the reason I do it is because people need to understand that even if we muddle through the next 3 months, we find a couple $1 million here and there, we restore some of the service cuts and moderate some of the fare increases, we're back here next year, and the year after, and the year after. This is actually the problem we need to fix, not the $161 million hole in this year's operating budget. Okay, so, but there is a $161 million hole in this year's operating budget, and the law that was passed in 2000 says that the MBTA has to start every budget year with a balanced budget. So there's a 5-member board of the MBTA. They meet the first Wednesday of every month, and they have a legal obligation to make sure that the T can't start its new budget year on July 1st unless on paper the budget is balanced. And in order to have it balanced by July 1st, the board basically needs to know by April what the fares and services are going to be, because there's a little lag time in there. So this policy conversation that we're having right now comes to a head probably the first Wednesday in April. Yes?
Stephanie, can you just, as an aside, mention the change in the board structure from during the reform?
Yeah, so they used to have a different, the MBTA used to have its own board. Now there's one board that is both the board of the Transportation Department and the MBTA. It is smaller. It doesn't have reserved slots. There used to be 2 reserved slots for the city of Boston, and one for this and one for that. It's just 5 people, 5 very well-intentioned, very overwhelmed people who are feeling like the bad guys in all of this. They've only existed for this is their 3rd year of existence, so they weren't making these votes when all these financial decisions were made, but they're the ones who are going to have to vote on the fare increase and the service cuts. So I feel bad for them, and I'm glad I'm not one of them. So I'm going to do this part real quick, because most of you said you were familiar, but if you have questions, comments, stick your hand up just like Joel did. That's great. So they proposed 2 alternatives. In alternative 1, the fare increase is bigger, but the service cuts are smaller. Okay? In scenario 2, they basically cut service more in order to keep the fare increase to only 35%. Okay? Those are sort of, that's like, basically it's your Hobson's choice, it's your rock and your hard place, however you want to call it. Neither one is like great. This one is projected to result in between 9 and 13% of all the riders fleeing the system. This one is projected to between 14 and 17%. We had a group of students here at Northeastern that was working with Central Transportation Planning staff last semester, looking at the process for estimating these ridership losses, and these are actually conservative numbers. I think we could be optimistic and say that they'll probably lose between 5 and 10% of their riders, but still that's not a good thing, either from a revenue perspective or an environmental perspective or a traffic congestion perspective, or, as I'll show you in a minute, an equity perspective, to continue with the theme that Mark Drayson started. So the other thing is, in scenario 1, they sort of raise most of the increase roughly the same across the board. Commuter rail is the same as buses. In scenario 2, they differentially try to keep the increase for bus riders lower, and I'll show you why that's true in a minute because of who bus riders are. The service cuts, so in scenario 1, it's a pretty surgical thing. They are proposing to eliminate 26% of the route miles, but it actually only affects 2% of the passengers. So in scenario 1, they did this cost effectiveness evaluation that's shown up at the top, where they sort of said, okay, how much does it really cost to run some of these routes where there's very low ridership? Let's get rid of the least cost-effective routes so that at least on balance, we'll save a lot of money relative to the number of people whose bus service will be taking away, right? So what they did is they said, we'll take the operating cost for the route, we'll subtract the revenue we can collect on it, we'll divide by the number of people who use it, we'll come up with this number, and then what we'll look at is what's the average number of how much we have to spend, net cost per passenger, and any route that's more than 3 times what we spend on average, those are the routes that we will eliminate in scenario 1. Now, Yep, wait.
It's important to point out, maybe you're about to, that this cost effectiveness cut was not applied to commuter rail, only to buses.
Right, so there's a couple of things about this, and this is sort of where the data thing comes in. Okay, so thing one, it only did it for buses. The commuter rail contract, because of the way it's structured, it's actually fairly, you can't do this and then make the cuts because they have contractual, they end up paying almost all of it out no matter how many people they serve. So on commuter rail, that's why they sort of propose this kind of wholesale, we'll just close it down after 10 and on weekends, because they can do that given the structure of their contract with Mass Bay Commuter Rail and sort of avoid actual costs of operating the system entirely, and therefore there's a real savings to the T because no one is reporting for work for the certain train or on Saturdays. That's one of the reasons we need to restructure the contract. So they've only applied this to buses. The other thing, though, that you need to know is, so when we talk about, this is a good time to sort of talk about this, so let's talk about what's actually on the website. So if you go to the MBTA website to start to understand this proposal, they have a whole section here on the fare increase, right? They have a whole place you can click. If you click on about, it's on the home page, or if you click on about the MBTA, then down here you go to fare proposal, and they have tons and tons of PDFs and Word documents, which is good. I mean, this is, believe me, having done these for many years, this is way more information. So there's a 94-page document on the website, which I'm sure all of you have read in detail, called the Potential MBTA Fare Increase and Service Reduction Impact Analysis. That's this thing here. So it's 94 pages long. And this is when they sort of go through the whole thing. So I eagerly read the whole 94 pages, looking to understand the data behind this bus service reduction plan, and there's none. There's a chart. Bus route is, times how many times we run. Okay, that's fine. And they'll show you that data. They'll show you what they spend on gas and bus drivers. Okay, that's piece one. That wasn't too bad. So piece number two is how much money do you collect on the route? Okay, this is where life gets interesting. How many of you guys use Charlie cards? How many use monthly passes? Okay, you are actually atypical. More people than this usually use monthly passes. Most bus riders are now on monthly pass. Even bus riders, I'll show you the data in a second. Even just, I mean, bus riders are less likely to use monthly passes than commuter rail riders or subway. Okay, so how do you attribute fare revenue to, I'll take the one from my hometown of Newton, the 52 bus, if everybody getting on the bus is on a fare? How much of that money is because you rode the 52 bus as opposed to because you took the 52 bus to the Green Line and got on the Green Line? And by the way, you also used your pass for some other trips downtown during the day, right? How do you do that, right? So the last time they did this service thing, we didn't have that many people on Charlie cards. So this might have made sense. Now, do you know what they do? They're just taking all the fare revenue and dividing it among all the services. So if you think about math, right? This is where the professor in me comes in. If you have an equation that has three variables, 1, 2, 3, this number is the same in every single one except the length of the route. This number is the same for all the services they run because they have no way of knowing how much revenue. I mean, there is a little component that's the fare box, the stuff they actually collect on board. That they do, but the overwhelming majority of the number is this number, right? But they don't say that anywhere, right? So I said, well, how do I know how you do that? And they said, oh, well, that's in a different part of the website. That's on the part of the website where we do bus service planning. And by the way, that's where the passenger data is. And I thought, oh, okay, well, I can find different things on the same website. So I'll go to the part of the website where we do bus service planning is considered a T project. God only knows why, but there it is. So you go under T projects, and under T projects, you go under service planning, because that's where all this data is going to be, and we want to see all this data because I want to know why the 52 buses on the chopping block in Newton and the 59 buses, and so I go biennial. Biennial, last time I checked, means every other year. So we have a 2008 bus service plan. That's the last one that's up there. They were supposed to do a 2010, they didn't get to it. They were supposed to do a 2011, they didn't get to it. So the only data, if you want to look at your bus line to understand why they're putting your bus line on the chopping block, is you have to look at the 2008 bus service plan. Now, ridership is up since 2008, right? So if the argument is, okay, the two numbers on the top of the equation were both a little shaky. On the denominator, the number on the bottom of the equation, that's riders. So you'd kind of like to know how many people rode it as recently as possible. The other thing is, okay, who here has ever gone on an MBTA bus and not tapped in your pass? Who here has ever gone on an MBTA bus and seen someone get in the back door and not tap in their pass? Okay, so where did the passenger counts come from, whether they're from 2008 or 2006 or 2004? Well, I assume they came from tapping in the pass, because where else would they get that number, right? So I was a little concerned because on the subway system, except for the surface green line, on the subway system, you go through a toll gate. There's a small amount of evasion, but honestly, probably the overwhelming majority of riders are actually stopping their passenger. And so if you ask me how many people board at State Street, and I'll show you in a minute how to get that data for yourself, I believe it, more or less. But if you ask me how many people board at the Northeastern E-Line stop, I actually have no clue. And if you ask me how many people ride the 39 bus, who knows, right? So, at this meeting, there was a person from planning who said, no, we have little people counters on all the buses and trains. It's a little sensor, and it counts people. I'm going to try to run that down. I've never heard of such a thing. I've been working on transit issues for 22 years. But I'm going to try to find out if there are actually people counters, and if there are, how one gets the data from the people counters, okay? Because I've never seen the data, but that's what I was told. But none of that is in any of this data. So, the best I can tell you if you want to look at your bus line is there's a couple places you can get data. You can get data from the 2008 service plan, and then if you want to know who more recently, how many people are riding it. So the MBTA produces something called the Blue Book, because the cover is blue, except for now. Don't believe the numbers about cost effectiveness because you're not sure about the fares and you're not sure about the ridership. Then it's more of a policy conversation. Okay, we have 2 north-south buses. We can only afford 1 north-south bus. What are the factors we should all be thinking about? Well, one of the factors we might want to think about is who gets served by which bus, which actual destinations, which one runs closer to the elderly housing project, which one runs closer to the senior center, which one runs closer to the schools. The 52 also serves 2 junior high schools and a high school. And again, if you think about how the MBTA does fares, so they're not going to like buses that serve students, because students are all on reduced cost passes. They're not going to like buses that serve seniors, because seniors are all on reduced cost passes. But as a matter of equity, like Mark was talking about this morning, maybe buses that serve students and seniors are really important, even if they don't generate as much money per passenger, because the students and seniors really need the buses more than other people do. So one of the things that you want to do when you're sort of participating in this policy conversation, and in particular if there are certain bus routes or service cuts that you feel should be reconsidered, is you're going to want to both think about the issue of how confident you are that they've genuinely calculated correctly how costly it is for them to run the specific bus or service, but then you also want to think about other questions and using some of the tools, just generally available tools, for example, like the Metro Boston Data Common, that there'll be a session on after lunch. You can create maps where you can, the transit lines are all in the Data Common, I think, right? So you can map the bus that you're worried about, and then you can look at, public schools, libraries, all the other data layers that exist, and you can kind of create a little map for yourself and for your peers and for your elected officials and sort of say, gee, this is a really important bus ride, and maybe it doesn't get as much ridership, or maybe it gets more ridership and they're undercounting that ridership, but either way, let me articulate why it is. Because it is my sense, and I'm a member of the advisory committee to the Massachusetts Department of Transportation and had long conversations with the advisory committee and the secretary about this, they're going to restore some of the cuts. Some, but not all of them. There's not going to be enough money to restore all of them. They're going to restore some of them, and so they actually really want to hear if we had 10 bus routes that we could put back on, which 10 should we put back on? So you want to sort of make the case for your particular bus route using the data that you can. So that's why on our website and on this sheet of paper, I have tried to give you some links to places where you can begin to find information from beyond what the MBTA uses if you want to make the argument that the MBTA is only looking at ridership and revenue, and that's fine, they're allowed to, but I would like to introduce some other ideas into this policy conversation. So I would like to introduce some ideas about, for example, what are the demographics served? So in the Newton hearing, somebody got up and said, this bus route, there are X thousands of people who live within walking distance of this bus route. And there are Y jobs within walking distance of this bus route. And so it's not just who's on it today, but what role does that bus route play, right, in the economy and the mobility of people in your community isn't necessarily captured by the current ridership. It's what's the potential. How does it, the thing about transportation systems is they're networks. They link things together. They only make sense as networks. And one of the things that is frustrating about the conversation, unavoidable, happens everywhere in the country, is you don't really know how a network works when you take some links out. Like honestly, maybe they'll pull these bus routes out, they'll shut the commuter rail at 10 and on the weekends, they'll shut the E-line right outside our door here, and it won't make a big difference because in networks, things move around. So, certainly the T's assumption is they'll shut the E-line down and everyone will take the 39 bus. And at the end of the day, the world won't be all that different a place. But they don't always work the way you think they will. So maybe they shut it down and a whole bunch of nurses who are using the E-line to get to jobs in Longwood Medical Area who have a shift change at 11 p.m. or who use commuter rail to get to Ruggles and then have a shift change at 11 p.m. They don't take the morning commuter rail either. So in the MBTA's thinking, they've taken away that trip at 11 o'clock at night because they've shut the service at 10, but they haven't taken away the morning trip. Or they've taken away the revenue from the once a week when you take the trip after 10, but they haven't and I actually asked the secretary this, and he's like, oh, didn't think about that. So commuter rail passes. Your commuter rail pass now buys you service Monday through Friday until 10 p.m. and no weekend service. I mean, after these, if you implement what they... Right now, it buys me 7-day-a-week service until late at night. Now it only buys me... Now, most commuter rail riders, I'm sure this will come as a shock to you, use the trains twice a day. Once in the morning, once to go home at night. They don't tend to hop on the train in the middle of the day, go back home, grab something, and go back to the office. So it's very different from bus riders and subway riders. When I take my Link Pass, right, I might, in a typical week, I might use my Link Pass 15 or 20 times. Back and forth to meetings, do go back in the middle of the day when my kid gets sick in the middle, whatever, okay? So, my Link Pass currently costs me $59. They're proposing to raise it to $80, but if the base fare is $2 and it's $80, do I use it 40 times a month? To use it 40 times a month, I need to use it 10 times a week. Do I use it 10 times a week? Oh yeah, almost every week I use it 10 times a week. Now I'm a commuter rail rider, okay? I use it Monday through Friday morning. Can't even use it on the weekend if I want to anymore. And can't use it, so I teach till 10 p.m. on Monday nights here at Northeastern. That's not like a hypothetical. I teach till 10 p.m. on Monday nights. John in the back sits in my class until 10 p.m. on Monday nights, right? I can't take commuter rail on Mondays. I mean, I'm not going to take my morning trip in because I got to get myself home, right? So now that commuter rail pass is good for me for Tuesdays through Fridays when I'm not traveling. So now I'm using once in the morning, once in the afternoon. So my commuter rail pass is good for me 32 times a month. That's it. Except for the commuter rail pass costs 37 times the multiple of the base fare. So I don't know why I would buy a commuter rail pass. And I'm a pretty diehard transit person. I already spend more on my commuter rail pass than it would cost me to park at Northeastern, much to my husband's chagrin, because Northeastern oversubsidizes parking, and I think that's a terrible thing, so I just take the train anyway. But I have to say, this is pushing it, even for me, okay? So I asked the secretary, I said, did you, when you priced the commuter rail passes, take into the account that they're no longer of any value to the riders on the weekends after 10 or on any day they have to go home after 10? And think about making them not cost 37 round trips a month, but cost 30 round trips. And he said, nah, never was discussed. So this is sort of why you have to kind of think and use data, right? So one of these websites, so these two websites are particularly interesting. I'm going to show you some data from this one. This one is called the Transit Oriented Development Database for those of you who know what transit-oriented development is, that's like when you build stuff near T stations, and you might think, transit-oriented development database, what does that have to do with me? Well, here's the cool thing about it. It has it has all the train stations in the state, in the country actually, there's 4,000 in there. It has Silver Line stations, it has all the proposed ones, so it has the Green Line in it, even though it doesn't exist yet, Green Line extension through Somerville. And then they draw a 1/4 mile and a 1/2 mile circle around it, and it will tell you how many people live there, how many jobs are there, how many people of different household incomes live there, how many people of different races live there. So it is actually and it will aggregate all those little circles into your corridor. So if I want a quick question to the how many jobs are served by the E-line, right? It will tell me in 30 seconds how many jobs are within a 1/4 and a 1/2 mile of all the E-line stops that I just check off. So it is a free website. You do have to create a login. It's one of those, but don't be intimidated when you get to the screen where it says login because it doesn't cost you anything. You just give them an email address and a password. It's yours to use. It's a lovely website. It's not what it was meant for, but it happens to work really well. Unfortunately, it doesn't have buses. So it works if you're working on the Mattapan high-speed trolley, or you're working on the E-line, or you're working on commuter rail, but it doesn't have the buses. We are actually, the Dukakis Center is working with the Center for Transit-Oriented Development, which developed that site, to identify a set of what we're calling high-frequency bus services in Massachusetts, ones that actually provide as much or more service than some of the subways do. And we're going to try to get those into the next iteration of that database, but not in time to influence the fare increase. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to sort of run through real quickly a couple quick examples of sort of using data. Right, so we talked about data, we talked about the fare increase. So here's one. This is what we've done with fares, just to kind of give you a sense. So one question, we've been talking about the cuts, now let's talk about the fares. Is the fare hike reasonable? Unreasonable? How do you judge, okay? What data could you use that would help you form an opinion? So the first thing we did is we looked at fares over history, going back to actually 1897, that's the Charlie, the nickel, you can't get off. And then you adjust them for inflation. That's not hard to do, that's what graduate students are for. So you adjust them for inflation. So one of the interesting things you see is for most of history, right, for 100 years, the tea cost $1.50. Round numbers, the tea cost the equivalent of $1.50. But since the last fare increase, it's now over the $2 mark in inflation-adjusted dollars. And of course, it's going to go higher, right? So if your question is the tea fare that they're proposing reasonable in light of history, this kind of data says no, actually it's sort of outside the boundaries, right? Then you can look at data from other transit agencies, right? That's another way of sort of asking, well, are we paying more or less than New York or whatever? Now the T has put some of that data on their database, but you know, they handpicked, right, the agencies that made it look good. So there's something called the National Transit Database, so we've put a link to that on the sheet and on our website, which has every transit system in the United States, so that if you want to look at Pittsburgh or Cleveland or some place that's not the places the T picked, you can just go through the database and understand what people are paying in other places. I think that's particularly important for the Haverhills and the Brocktons and the Framinghams of the world because honestly they're more comparable to, say, small older industrial cities in Connecticut or Ohio, and so you might want to know, well, what does Hartford pay as opposed to what does, Chicago pay? So that's another kind of data sort of you can use. Another issue is not just what's the amount of the fare, right, but what percentage of the budget of the transit agency are the fare payers paying as opposed to the subsidy paying, basically. So that's called the fare recovery ratio. So you can calculate that number a million different ways. This is actually not the number that the T uses, but the reason that this is this number is because I did it from the National Transit Database because they all report the same way. Okay? So sometimes when you want to compare data, you have to remember that you need to use a source. So every transit system in the country, they have to use a certain methodology to put their data into this database, which means that I can actually ask how much do fare holders in Washington and New York and San Francisco pay compared to those in Boston and know that the answer is right, even if it's not the same answer the T gives you. So what you see is, right now, these are pre-fare increase fares. We are a bit on the low side, but certainly not the lowest one in the country. We're going to recalculate this with the new fares. We haven't done that yet. I think we'll be on the high end.
Stephanie, just I serve on the board of the MWRA.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's striking to me is we increase water rates every year, but it's incremental, 2.9,
Right.
3.5.
Right.
It seems like we create this crisis because we do it every 5 years, or in one case every 10 years, And so then we look at a 40% increase.
Yes, and that is true. So that's another issue. This is the fair recovery ratio over time. That yellow line is a goal that was set by something called the Blue Ribbon Committee. It was in 2000, right after we did forward funding. They said fair riders should pay half the cost, other people should pay half the cost. I'm going to get to the answer to your question in a second. We've never even approached 50% in this state. So it has been our policy objective for nearly 2 decades, but nobody actually understands what it means. This fare increase does not get the fair recovery ratio up to 50%, and this is excluding debt service, okay? So the problem is the bonds, okay. Take the $450 million a year debt service out of the budget before you calculate the percentage of fares. That's what I do because I don't think fare holders should be paying debt service, so I just do it. But so does the T, so they don't think so either. Even with this increase, okay, there was a spreadsheet on our website because the T wouldn't create one, so we did. They put out a pro forma. They put out their financials for the next 4 years, and it has the debt service number, and it has the expected fare revenue without the fare increase. So we just added, and it has the expected expenses without the service cuts. So we subtracted the cost of the service that they're not providing, added in the fare, and then calculated the fare recovery ratio, and we calculated the percentage of the budget that's being spent on debt service, and we have put it on the website as an Excel spreadsheet because we believe in data sharing, so you can manipulate it different ways if you want. Joel's point is true. If we really think 50% is, so the numbers that we're talking about, while they're scary to us, there's 2 different ways to think of them. One is, if we really think 50% is a good policy objective, then we're not even there with this increase, and the problem is we should have raised them sooner, right? Or, the other way to think about this is, when they recommended 50%, they had actually no idea what that meant to real people. They didn't calculate what it would mean per trip or for a monthly pass from Zone 6, and now we actually know, because this is close to 50%. This gets us up in the 47 to 48% range, depending on whether it's scenario 1 or 2. And if we feel that those fares are too high, then the answer is that's the wrong policy goal, right? But again, you need to know the numbers. There are a handful of transit systems that have started doing small, regular increases and are seeing more financial stability and less ridership loss. So we can't do that now because we're sort of in the hole, but it does raise the question going forward, should we dial this one back a little bit, but tell everybody it's going to go up 10% 2 years from now or 3 years from now. That's the price we pay for dialing it back, and then it'll go up, a dime or whatever every few years. We don't know the answer. That's another part of the policy debate we're not having. And then another final piece of data that people have asked me, so again, we just calculated it is, well, are fares going up faster or slower than other things that we pay money for in that time? Because one of the arguments for the fare increase has been, we're just catching up with inflation, right? The problem is that inflation's been kind of low, so the consumer price index has gone up 12% since the last fare increase, and they're proposing 35 to 43%. So we're just catching up with inflation isn't actually true. And again, all of these data points, they're all available. You can get the consumer price index, so what we're trying to do with these kinds of slides is to begin to tell a story about maybe this fare increase is sort of too much all at one time. You can't justify it by it's comparable to other agencies. You can't justify it by we're catching up to inflation. On the other hand, it calls into question this 50% fare recovery ratio policy, which has actually never been formalized by the legislature because we don't get to 50% and they seem really high. So this is just an example of how we at the Dukakis Center took data from a lot of different places, right, and put it together to sort of tell a story about where the fare increases seemed reasonable and unreasonable. The last data set that I want to mention, and then I know you guys need to go to lunch, yeah?
Do you have anywhere the data for the gas tax increase or lack thereof?
No, but that would be a great graph because it would just be flat since 1994. Clearly made that. Okay, so the last thing that I want to mention to you, and there's a link on the website. So the MBTA in 2008 and 2009 did tens of thousands of surveys where they handed people on the buses and train surveys and asked them a whole bunch of questions. Okay, they used this to calibrate the regional travel model, but they threw all of the survey data up on the web, and the link is on there and on our website. And it was a pretty reasonable number of surveys. Okay, so they did close to 50,000 surveys. I mean, it's not like statistically significant for a given bus route, but over the system, there's a lot of data, and they asked really cool questions. But the way the MBTA put it up on the website
they put up one report that had all the data for like half the orange line, and then one report that had the other half of the orange line, and then one that had the blue line, and then one that had all the buses from the Albany garage. I really like the bus one. A different one that had all the buses from the Lynn garage. So, and the only way to aggregate them was to do what I did, which is to take 2 summer interns and make them create a giant Excel spreadsheet with the data from all of the surveys, because otherwise you couldn't add it all up and start to play with it. And they actually also then calculated weights. So they calculated like what are the total boardings at any given station so that you could weight the survey results by the boardings to get a meaningful picture. So on our website you will now find this giant Excel spreadsheet with all of the passenger survey data by line. We did not break it down into individual bus lines because the numbers do get too small to have any statistical significance, and since we're data geeks that worries us a little, but you can create charts like this. So this is income, okay? This is our equity conversation. So this is the income of people who use commuter rail, and this is the income distribution of people who use buses, okay? So, and this is the racial distribution of people. So green are white people. This is the ethnicity, Latino, non-Latino distribution of people by different modes. You can ask why people use it. So one of the differences between commuter rail and bus riders is commuter rail riders really use it to go back and forth to work. Bus riders use their buses for all kinds of things. They use it to shop, they use it to get to school. So again, if you're arguing that cutting bus service is problematic, it gives you some data to work with. This question of how you price passes, right? There's a concern about, there was some concern that people using buses were still mostly using cash and Charlie tickets. It's actually not true as much as we think, so we could think this is an easier way to look at it. This is the percentage of people who are on monthly passes, so you can see that even for the buses, while it's lower, the vast majority of, 2/3 of bus riders are on monthly passes, another 30% are using the Charlie cards, under 3% are using their Charlie tickets. So what that tells you is those sort of, that really high price they say, like if you pay in cash for a bus, is not really the price most actual riders will experience. So these are, again, just some examples of what we did with the spreadsheet, which we created. So we put the spreadsheet online so that other people can sort of use it to sort of ask different questions than the questions we're asking.
So can I just ask, because this is
Yeah.
a voluntary survey,
Yeah.
presumably people who are monthly commuters are going to be more invested than people who use it on a day-to-day basis.
Yes, and you can look at that data, because they asked the question, like, how often do you use it? And most of the people answered 5, 6, or 7 days a week. So you can look at all of that, you can draw your own conclusions, but the point is, it's when the last few fare increases, we had no information about who used the system, okay? I remember when we were doing the fare increase in 97, and I asked what was the most recent profile they had of the sociodemographics of their users. It was from 1979. Now, those of you who have lived here a while know that we changed as a region between 1979 and the late 1990s. So the fact that we actually have current data is actually a wonderful thing. I don't know why people haven't made more of it. We're actually working on a transportation report card and a rider profile. Unfortunately, they weren't going to be done in time for this conversation, so that's why we just put the raw data up on the website so that people can use it. So where does that leave us? So this is the timetable. The public comment period, if you want to do something in writing, is through March 1st, which means you actually have time to spend with this data and think and write stuff down. So the public meetings are important, but I would say the written part is going to be really important. And they made the written deadline a full month before the board meeting on purpose because I really do believe that they are committed to trying to take that input seriously. And, at the end of the day, the T can only do what they can do with the money they have. At some point in the next 3 months, someone, the governor, the secretary of administration, or finance, someone is going to say to Secretary Davey, I believe this with all my heart and soul, you know what, we can make up 20 million of difference, or 30 million of difference, or 40 million of difference. It's going to be a number that he's going to be given. And the question is going to be, I'm going to have to, the fare increase is going to have to cover 60 or 70 million. I'm going to have to do 20 or 30 million in service cuts, but I don't have to do 160 million anymore now. I only have to do 120 million. The question is going to be, where do I put the money back? Where do I reinvest the 40 million I thought I had to cut that I don't have to cut? And by the way, by advocacy, we can make the gap smaller, right? We can
argue that they shouldn't hand him $20 million to fix the problem, they should hand him $50 million to hand him, you know. So part of it is we can influence how big the fare increase service cut needs to be, but it's not, they're not gonna hand him 160. I would, more than the Super Bowl, I would totally bet on that. I would totally bet, I've been at this a long time, they are not gonna hand him 160 million, and they shouldn't. Quite honestly, we haven't raised fares in a long time, we're way below a reasonable fare recovery ratio. We should raise fares a little bit, we should eliminate some of the least cost-effective routes. There's nothing wrong with that as a matter of policy. So some of it's gonna happen, some of it's not, and what data can really influence is when there is some resources on the table, what do you do with it? Do you lower the fares? Do you restore services? Which services? Do you know, there's a lot of public advocacy now around, oh my God, how can you close the commuter rail on the weekends? How can you stop subsidizing the ferries? You know, and that, they can do that. If they do that, then they're gonna restore fewer buses. So if you wanna influence that conversation, we all need to marshal data to do that, because my bottom line in every talk that I give, you need your help. So I will be at the desk out there for questions. Grab copies of this, go to our website, link your websites to our website, and use this information, this knowledge, this data, and you know, really make a difference. We have 2 months. We can really all make a difference in what ends up happening. Okay?